The courtroom's silent reckoning. The air inside Atlanta's Supreme Courthouse was thick with an unspoken tension. The rows of polished wooden benches were filled with lawyers, journalists, and a scattering of everyday citizens waiting to see Judge Alan Graves deliver yet another swift and merciless verdict. He was known for his ruthless judgments, his cold and calculated demeanor, and the absolute authority he wielded inside these walls. But today was different. As he adjusted his black robe and tapped his gavel against the polished oak of his desk, a familiar rhythm of finality played out. Another case. Another life sentenced. Another name reduced to a number in the system. His deep voice resonated through the silent courtroom. In the case of the state of Georgia versus Amira Lawson, the evidence is clear. Theft of commercial property valued at $80, despite your unfortunate circumstances, cannot be excused. The court has considered the facts, and I am now prepared to deliver your sentence. The accused, a thin young woman with rich brown skin and fiery dark eyes, barely flinched. She was seated at the defendant's table, hands clenched into fists on her lap. Her second-hand hoodie swallowed her small frame. Despite her fragile appearance, there was something unyielding about her, something waiting to strike. Her public defender, a frazzled man with crooked glasses and a suit that had seen better days, shuffled his papers. Sweat beaded on his forehead. He knew what was coming. Judge Graves lifted his gavel, the polished wood gleaming under the fluorescent light. His fingers tightened around it. It was time to render justice. And that's when she spoke. "Daddy." The word cut through the courtroom like a razor-sharp blade. The gavel froze in midair. A gasp rippled through the spectators. The air seemed to grow colder. The reporters, who had been lazily waiting for the sentencing to conclude, suddenly snapped to attention, their fingers racing across their keyboards like wildfire. Judge Graves's hand trembled, the gavel clattering onto the desk instead of striking it. His face drained of color. The mighty judge, cold, ruthless, untouchable, had just been unmasked. Amira stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. She did not waver. She did not blink. Her voice was steady, firm, and filled with quiet fury. "You left me. You left my mother. And now you're about to sentence me like I'm just another case in your career." The silence was deafening. Even the court bailiffs, who were trained to be indifferent, stared wide-eyed at the unfolding scene. Judge Graves opened his mouth, but no words came out. His throat was dry. His hands were visibly shaking. The cameras were flashing now, capturing every detail of his stricken face. His carefully crafted reputation was cracking like glass under pressure. The prosecutor, a stiff-lipped woman in a navy blue power suit, stammered, flipping through her case file as if trying to find something, anything, that could explain what was happening. But there was no law, no protocol, no legal precedent for this. This wasn't just a case. This was a reckoning. The whispers from the gallery grew louder, merging into a wave of noise. Did she just say, "The judge's daughter"? Oh my God, is this real? One of the younger journalists had already started live streaming. The courtroom was erupting into chaos. Judge Graves pushed back from the desk, his mind spinning. He couldn't breathe. This isn't happening. This can't be happening. His secret, the one he had buried for 22 years, was standing right in front of him. And she wasn't done. "The truth is out now. You don't get to run from it anymore." A hurricane of emotions crashed through the room. The air was thick with shock, betrayal, and something even more dangerous: vindication. The reporters, sensing blood in the water, began shouting questions. "Judge Graves, is this true? How long have you known about your daughter? Will you step down from the bench?" The walls of the courthouse, which had stood firm against thousands of cases, verdicts, and scandals, felt like they were shaking. The judge shot to his feet, his chair toppling over behind him. His voice, usually a commanding force, came out hoarse. "This case is adjourned." He turned swiftly, nearly knocking over his clerk, and stormed toward the exit. His steps were frantic, uneven, almost desperate. Nothing like the controlled, measured strides he was known for. But the past wouldn't let him escape so easily. The doors burst open as the media swarmed, their cameras flashing, their voices an unrelenting storm of questions. He shoved past them, ignoring their accusations, ignoring their judgment, ignoring the fact that his entire world had just collapsed. Meanwhile, Amira remained standing in the center of the courtroom, surrounded by chaos. But she wasn't afraid. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing against her, but for the first time in her life, she felt powerful. She had spent her whole childhood waiting for this day. And now her father, the man who had abandoned her and her mother, was finally facing his reckoning. The battle was just beginning. The fallout of truth. The courthouse corridors had never felt so suffocating. Judge Alan Graves moved like a hunted man, his polished shoes clacking against the marble floor. Sweat clung to his temples, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The world around him was a blur of flashing lights, reporters, and courtroom officials whispering in hushed, shocked tones. He had to get out. For the first time in his career, he didn't have control. Judge Graves, can you confirm that Amira Lawson is your daughter? Your Honor, how long have you kept this secret? Do you intend to step down from the bench? Their voices followed him like ghosts as he barreled through the courthouse lobby, pushing past security. The courthouse doors slammed open, and the burning Atlanta sun hit him like a hammer. But outside was worse. Cameras, reporters, news vans lined up against the sidewalk like vultures waiting for a corpse. People had their phones out, recording live. The weight of their stares choked him. He had sentenced thousands of people over the years, breaking lives without a second thought. But now, standing on the courthouse steps, his own judgment day had arrived. A reporter shoved a microphone toward his face. Judge Graves, are you going to fight the paternity claim? The judge stumbled back, momentarily blinded by the flashing lights. His entire career, his legacy, was unraveling in real time. He gritted his teeth and pushed forward. No comment, no reaction, just keep walking. A black Mercedes-Benz was waiting at the curb, his driver already holding the door open. He practically threw himself inside, slamming the door shut as the noise outside erupted into chaos. Drive. The driver hesitated, watching the commotion through the rearview mirror. Now. The car sped off, leaving behind the courthouse that had once been his kingdom. And behind him, inside that courtroom, the aftermath. Amira stood her ground. She didn't flinch. She didn't back down. The weight of every camera lens zeroed in on her, but she held her head high. She wasn't the one who should feel shame. A bailiff leaned toward her. You okay, miss? She nodded. More than okay. Her public defender, Daniel Ross, was still sitting, frozen, his face pale as if someone had drained the blood from his body. He had been preparing for a petty theft defense, not a national scandal. You, he stammered. Amira turned toward him, her expression unapologetic. You're welcome, she said dryly. Daniel just rubbed his temples. The courtroom exploded into movement. Security tried, and failed, to regain order as reporters flooded the aisles. Spectators, attorneys, and even the jury were talking over each other, buzzing like a shaken hive. The prosecutor, Madeline Carter, slammed her case files shut. Her carefully planned trial had just been obliterated. This is a goddamn circus, she muttered, her manicured nails digging into the table. Amira turned toward her. And yet, you still want to prosecute me for an $80 bracelet. Carter opened her mouth, then shut it, because suddenly the case seemed so small. Compared to the bombshell that had just dropped, who even cared about a theft charge anymore? One by one, the jurors started filing out. The judge was gone. The courtroom was in chaos. Trial over. The escape plan. Amira pushed past the crowd, slipping through a side exit before the media could swarm her. She barely made it a block away before someone caught up with her. That was reckless. She turned, her heart still hammering from the adrenaline. Leah Spencer, her best friend, her only real family, stood there, arms crossed. I know. Leah's sharp brown eyes narrowed. No, you don't. You think you won. But you just made yourself a target. Amira scoffed. A target? He's the one, whoa. Leah grabbed her arm, pulling her into an alleyway. This isn't just about him. Her voice was dead serious. Amira felt the air shift. What do you mean? Leah exhaled, checking over her shoulder. Your mother never told you everything. She didn't just leave that man because he was a coward. She left because she was scared of him. A cold weight settled in Amira's stomach. Leah wasn't the type to exaggerate. Scared of what? She demanded. Leah hesitated. Then she said something that sent a chill through Amira's spine. She told me that if she ever went missing, it wouldn't be an accident. The words hit Amira like a punch. Her mother had always avoided talking about her past. Amira had assumed it was painful, not dangerous. Now she wasn't so sure. We need to get out of here, Leah muttered, already scanning for an escape route. Why? Amira whispered. Leah turned back to face her. Because I guarantee you, he's coming for you now. Meanwhile, Judge Graves wasn't going home. His driver expected to take him to his gated mansion in Buckhead, where his wife, Eleanor Graves, would be waiting with a drink and an ultimatum. But Graves had a different destination in mind. His past. The cars sped through the back streets of Atlanta, weaving into darker territory. The polished skyscrapers of downtown gave way to abandoned warehouses, old gas stations, and dimly lit liquor stores. Finally, the Mercedes slowed in front of an old barbershop. It had no name, no advertisements, just a faded Kilo Z sign in the window. Graves exhaled sharply and stepped out. Inside, the air reeked of smoke and whiskey, and sitting at a leather chair in the back, sipping bourbon from a crystal glass, was the man he'd hoped he'd never have to see again. Vincent Merrick. Old money, old crime, and the last person Graves ever wanted to owe. The older man looked up, his sharp, piercing gaze slicing through Graves like a blade. Well, Vincent murmured, setting his glass down with deliberate slowness. Look what the cat dragged in. Graves clenched his fists. He hated this, hated needing help. But right now, he needed to protect himself. And that meant silencing his daughter. One way or another. Secrets in the shadows. The air inside Vincent Merrick's barbershop was thick with the scent of aged bourbon, stale cigar smoke, and old power. Judge Alan Graves sat across from the man who had once controlled half of Atlanta's criminal underworld. Even now, after decades, Vincent hadn't lost his edge. His silver hair was slicked back, and his sharp, calculating gaze cut through Graves like a blade. The dim lighting cast shadows over his angular face, making him look more like a predator in waiting than an aging crime lord. Between them, a bottle of Macallan 25 sat untouched, its amber liquid glowing like molten gold under the low-hanging bulbs. Vincent poured himself a glass, but didn't offer one to Graves. Instead, he leaned back, swirling his drink, watching him with amusement. The great Alan Graves, he mused, taking a slow sip. A Supreme Court judge sitting in my chair, looking like a man about to beg. Graves's jaw clenched. He hated this, hated needing this man. But desperate times demanded desperate alliances. You and I both know why I'm here, Graves said, keeping his voice even. Vincent smirked. Do we? He reached into his desk drawer, pulling out a thin, yellowed file. He tossed it onto the table between them. The name on the tab sent a cold shiver down Graves's spine. Camille Benson. Vincent took another slow sip of his drink before setting it down, his sharp gaze never leaving Graves. You should have let sleeping dogs lie, Ellen, he said, voice quiet but full of warning. But now your little secret has woken up, and it's barking." Graves's hands curled into fists. "She's not just barking, Vincent. She's about to bite." Vincent let out a dry chuckle. "Then I assume you want her muzzled." Graves inhaled sharply, his heart hammering in his chest. He knew what Vincent was really asking. Was he here to shut Amira up? Or was he here to silence her permanently? Graves swallowed hard. Was he willing to cross that line? Vincent studied him for a moment before chuckling again. "Relax, Alan. I already know you don't have the stomach for this." He picked up the file and slid it back into his drawer. "But I do." Graves's stomach tightened. Vincent was always 10 steps ahead. "What do you know?" Graves demanded. Vincent exhaled, standing up, walking toward the window. He pulled back the blinds slightly, peering out into the darkened street. "I know your daughter isn't as clueless as you hoped. I know she's been digging into Camille's past, and I know she's getting close to something she shouldn't." He turned back, eyes gleaming like a wolf in the dark. "She's close to the truth, Alan." Graves felt his breath catch. The truth. The thing that could ruin him. The thing that could get them all killed. Vincent stepped closer, leaning in, his breath heavy with bourbon. "You really want to protect her?" he asked, voice low. Graves nodded, his throat dry. "I do." Vincent smirked. "Then you'd better hope I get to her before someone else does." Meanwhile, Amira sat in Leah's small apartment, the glow of her laptop screen casting eerie shadows across the dimly lit room. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitation weighing heavily on her shoulders. She had enough information to blow up her father's world. But now, she had questions she didn't know how to answer. Her mother's death wasn't an accident. And it wasn't just a tragic case of neglect. Something darker was lurking beneath the surface. Leah sat across from her, arms crossed. "You know, once you publish this, there's no going back." Amira nodded. "I know." She exhaled, clicking the trackpad. Her post went live. Headline: "The Judge, the Secret, and the Murder Cover-Up. The Truth About Alan Graves." Within minutes, the post had been shared hundreds of times. Within an hour, the first news stations were reaching out for interviews. And within 2 hours, the first threat arrived. A single text message from an unknown number. "Delete everything, or you die." The blood drained from Amira's face. Leah snatched the phone from her hand. Her eyes scanned the message, then her expression darkened. "We need to move. Now." Amira's hands trembled. Who sent that?" Leah's voice was cold as steel. "Someone who doesn't want the truth getting out." She stood up, grabbed a duffel bag, and began shoving in essentials. Cash, burner phones, fake IDs. Amira watched in stunned silence. "Wait, how do you even have all this?" Leah didn't look up. "Because I've been preparing for this moment my whole damn life." Back at the courthouse, the conference room was in chaos. News stations were airing the story nonstop. Alan Graves's face was plastered all over the screens. His colleagues, judges, prosecutors, politicians, were panicking. A junior official rushed into the room, breathless. Sir, we have a problem." The Chief Justice, an older man with graying hair, looked up sharply. "What now?" The official held up his phone. "She just went public." The Chief Justice snatched the device, his face paling as he read the headline. "God damn it," he muttered, slamming the phone on the table. He turned to the other judges. "We have to distance ourselves from Graves. Now." Murmurs of agreement filled the room. But one judge, the oldest among them, stayed silent. His fingers tapped slowly against the table. The others turned to him. "Justice Carter, what are you thinking?" Justice Carter leaned forward, voice measured. "I'm thinking, someone's going to clean up this mess." He smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made grown men shiver. Meanwhile, Amira and Leah sped through the back streets of Atlanta, their car weaving in and out of dark alleyways. Leah's grip on the wheel was tight, her jaw clenched. Amira kept looking behind them, her heart pounding. Finally, she spoke. "Where are we going?" Leah didn't answer. She just turned off the main road, heading toward the one place Amira never thought she'd go. "To see your father." Amira stiffened. "Are you insane?" Leah glanced at her, her expression dead serious. "No, but I need you to understand something." She took a deep breath before continuing. "Alan Graves isn't the only one with secrets." The car rolled to a stop in front of an old building, and as Amira stepped out, her breath caught in her throat. Because standing there, waiting for her, was Vincent Merrick, the man who once owned Atlanta's underworld. The man who had answers. And possibly the man who ordered her mother's death. The wolves close in. The night air was thick with tension. Amira stepped out of the car, her hands clenched into fists. The city lights flickered in the distance, but here, outside the old warehouse district, it was darker, quieter, too quiet. And in that silence stood Vincent Merrick. The man was a relic of another era, dressed in an expensive charcoal suit that contrasted sharply against the cracked pavement beneath his feet. His silver hair was slicked back, and his cold, calculating eyes studied Amira like she was an equation waiting to be solved. Leah killed the engine and stepped out beside Amira, her body tense, her hand hovering near the gun hidden beneath her jacket. "You brought her here?" Merrick asked, his voice smooth but edged with something unreadable. Leah didn't flinch. She deserves answers. Vincent exhaled sharply, then turned his gaze toward Amira. "I suppose you think you're clever, don't you?" Amira squared her shoulders. "I don't think. I know." A ghost of a smirk flickered across his lips, spoken like a Graves. The words sent a chill down her spine. Vincent motioned toward the building behind him. "Come inside." Amira hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around, to run. But she wasn't backing down now. Not when she was this close to the truth. She followed him through a rusted steel door into what looked like an old private lounge. Dusty leather chairs, low-hanging light bulbs, and a bar lined with expensive bottles of whiskey told her this wasn't just some abandoned warehouse. This was a meeting place. A place where deals were made and lives were ruined. Vincent gestured toward a seat across from his large oak desk. She didn't sit. "I know my father came to you," Amira said, cutting straight to the point. Vincent chuckled, pouring himself a drink. "Smart girl." He took a sip, watching her over the rim of the glass. "Yes." He came running. Amira felt her stomach tighten. She knew it. Her father wasn't just panicking about the scandal. He was afraid. But afraid of what? What did he ask for? She pressed. Vincent set his glass down with a soft clink. Protection. Damage control. And, if necessary, options. Amira's heart skipped a beat. She knew what options meant. Her father had considered silencing her permanently. Leah shifted beside her, her posture coiled like a spring. She had heard it too. Vincent studied Amira for a long moment, then sighed. "But I told him no." She blinked. "What?" He leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "Because, sweetheart, if someone wants you dead, it ain't me." A cold shiver ran down Amira's spine. Leah stepped in, her voice sharp. "Then who?" Vincent chuckled. "You're thinking too small. This isn't just about your father. It's about what he was protecting." Amira's blood ran cold. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "My mother." Vincent's eyes narrowed. Then he slid a folder across the desk toward her. Amira hesitated before picking it up. Her hands trembled as she opened it, and what she saw made her stomach drop. Inside were old surveillance photos, legal documents, news clippings from 22 years ago. And at the center of it all, her mother, Camille Benson. But she wasn't just some poor woman who had been abandoned by Alan Graves. She had been a witness, a whistleblower, A threat to the system. Vincent watched her expression darken as she pieced it together. Your mother stumbled onto something she shouldn't have. He gestured toward a single piece of paper at the bottom of the file. A signed affidavit. Her mother's sworn statement to an unknown attorney. Amira's lips moved as she read it aloud, her voice hollow. I, Camille Benson, testify that Alan Graves, Eleanor Graves, and James Whittaker are knowingly involved in an ongoing conspiracy to launder illegal campaign funds and eliminate key witnesses who could expose them. The room felt like it was tilting. Her father, his wife, James Whittaker. They had been involved in something far bigger than she ever imagined, and her mother had been ready to expose them. Until she suddenly died in a car accident. A setup. Amira's breath came in short, sharp bursts. Her mother had known she was going to die. She had known. Leah's hand came down on her shoulder, steadying her. Amira. Focus. Amira turned to Vincent, her voice shaking. Why are you showing me this? Vincent took another slow sip of his drink. Because, sweetheart, someone already knows you have this information. Asterisk, asterisk. He tossed a burner phone onto the table. It buzzed once. Amira's eyes locked onto the screen. It was a message. Just 3 words. We are filming now. Elsewhere. Alan Graves sat alone in his dimly lit home office, a glass of whiskey untouched in front of him. The walls around him were lined with legal books, awards, framed newspaper articles praising his career. But for the first time, none of it meant anything. He had spent decades burying the past, but now it was digging itself out of the grave. He couldn't run anymore. His hands shook as he picked up his phone and dialed a number. After 3 rings, a familiar voice answered. It's done. Graves swallowed hard. No. There was a pause. Then the voice on the other end spoke again, its tone ice cold. Then we'll finish it for you. The line went dead. And Judge Alan Graves knew, in that moment, he had just signed his daughter's death warrant. The deadliest truth. The warehouse felt like a coffin. Amira's fingers tightened around the burner phone, her pulse hammering as she read the message again. We are coming now. Leah grabbed the phone from her hand, scanning the screen, her body tensing like a coiled spring. We need to move. Now. Vincent Merrick, sitting across the desk, took a slow sip of his bourbon, watching the 2 women with a mix of amusement and caution. He had seen this kind of panic before. He had caused this kind of panic before. Too late, he muttered, standing up. Amira turned sharply. What do you mean? A low rumble vibrated through the floor. Leah's head snapped up. She knew that sound. Engines. Multiple. A convoy of black SUVs had just pulled into the lot outside. Amira's stomach dropped. Vincent exhaled slowly, rolling his neck. Looks like we have company. The wolves had arrived. Outside the warehouse, the lead SUV's headlights cut through the fog, bathing the warehouse entrance in harsh, unnatural light. 4 black-clad figures stepped out, their movements swift, precise, professional. These weren't random thugs. These were hitmen. A tall man stepped forward. His Italian leather shoes crunched against the gravel, his face cast in shadow beneath the buzzing street lamp. James Whittaker. His hands were in his pockets, relaxed, but his presence was suffocating. 2 more figures stepped out behind him, their hands gripping suppressed handguns. One of them leaned in. Orders. James didn't answer immediately. He studied the warehouse, his lips curling into a smirk. Sweep the building. Kill Merrick. He rolled his shoulders, cracking his neck. And bring me the girl. Inside the warehouse, Vincent moved first. In one smooth motion, he reached beneath his desk, pulled out a black Sig Sauer, and chambered around. Time to go, he said. Leah grabbed Amira's wrist. There's a back exit. But Vincent shook his head. They already know about it. They wouldn't have come unprepared. Amira swallowed hard. So what do we do? Vincent flicked the safety off his gun. We fight. The assault begins. The warehouse doors exploded inward as a wave of black-clad assassins flooded in, their movements efficient, their weapons raised. Merrick moved like a man 20 years younger, his gun flashing as he took the first shot. Bang! A silenced grunt, and the first attacker dropped. Bang! Bang! Leah's pistol barked, taking down another. Amira pressed herself against the wall, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. She had never been in a firefight before. This was real. The sharp scent of gunpowder filled the air. Vincent grabbed her by the collar, pulling her down behind the bar as another hail of bullets shredded the bottles above them, sending glass shards raining down. "If you're gonna panic, now's the time to do it, kid," he growled. Amira clenched her jaw. "I'm not panicking." Vincent smirked. "Good. Then hold this." He shoved a 9mm pistol into her hand. Amira's breath hitched. "I don't." "Point, and pull the damn trigger," he snapped, before popping up and dropping another attacker. Leah makes a call. Leah ducked behind an overturned table, her mind racing. They were outnumbered, outgunned. If they stayed, they were dead. She grabbed her phone and dialed. The line rang once before connecting. "It's me," she whispered. "We need the package delivered. Now." A pause. Then a voice answered. "Understood." Leah ended the call. If they could hold out for 5 minutes, backup was coming. But 5 minutes in a firefight felt like a lifetime. The turning point. James Whittaker watched the gunfight unfold from the safety of his SUV, a cigarette dangling between his fingers. One of his men turned toward him. "We're losing people." James exhaled smoke slowly. "That's Vincent Merrick for you." His eyes flickered toward the warehouse rooftop. A single sniper was perched there, waiting. James smirked. Time to change the odds. He raised his hand. The sniper fired. Inside the warehouse. Crack! Vincent staggered back, a red bloom spreading across his shoulder. Amira's blood ran cold. Vincent. He gritted his teeth, pressing a hand to the wound, but he stayed on his feet. Leah swore under her breath. They had a sniper. They wouldn't last another 3 minutes. Amira made a decision. She grabbed Vincent's backup revolver, stood up, and ran. Right toward the back door. James gets what he wants. Outside, James Whittaker watched as the door burst open. And there she was, Amira Lawson. His smirk widened. She was young. She was fast. But she wasn't faster than a bullet. Bang! Amira hit the ground hard. Pain exploded in her left leg as a bullet ripped through her thigh. She barely had time to scream before 2 men descended on her, grabbing her arms. The world spun, the pain in her leg blinding. James crouched down beside her. "You put up a good fight, kid," he said, almost impressed. He nodded to his men. "Load her up. We're done here." Leah's backup arrives. The black SUV had barely pulled away when it happened. The roar of an incoming military-grade helicopter shook the ground. A SWAT team rappelled down, rifles raised, moving like ghosts through the battlefield. Leah rushed forward, but she was too late. The SUV vanished into the night, taking Amira with it. Leah's knuckles turned white as she clenched her fists. She turned toward Vincent, who was being helped up by a SWAT officer. Her voice was ice cold. Where would they take her? Vincent grimaced, pain evident in his face. "If I had to guess." He wiped blood from his mouth, then muttered, "Straight to Eleanor Graves." Meanwhile, Amira drifted in and out of consciousness. She could feel the vibration of the road, the cold metal of handcuffs around her wrists. Then, a familiar voice, a woman's voice. "Hello, sweetheart." Amira forced her eyes open, and there she was, Eleanor Graves, her father's wife, the woman who had ordered her mother's murder. Eleanor smiled, reaching out to stroke Amira's blood-stained face. "You've caused quite a mess." Her voice was calm, almost amused. Then she leaned in, whispering so close Amira could feel her breath. "It's time to clean it up. A cage of gold and blood. Somewhere in Atlanta's underworld." Amira's head throbbed as she drifted back into consciousness. The last thing she remembered was the cold metal of the SUV's floor pressing against her cheek, the unbearable pain in her leg, James Whittaker's smug voice. Now her eyes fluttered open to a different kind of nightmare. She was not in a dungeon. She was not in a dark basement. She was in a palace. The room was lavish, drenched in wealth. Marble floors gleamed under the chandelier's dim light. Velvet curtains hung like shadows around the enormous windows. Expensive art, real art, not cheap reproductions, lined the walls. And yet, beneath all the beauty, something felt wrong. Amira tried to move, but her wrists were bound. Golden handcuffs. Her pulse pounded as she forced herself upright. She was on a plush white sofa, its silk cushions untouched by time. That's when she saw her. Eleanor Graves, sitting across from her, perfectly poised, holding a glass of wine, as if this were nothing more than an evening chat. "Good morning, dear." Her voice was smooth, like silk wrapped around steel. Amira's jaw clenched. "Where the hell am I?" Eleanor sighed, swirling her wine. "Somewhere safe." Safe. The word sounded like a joke. Amira's left leg throbbed, and she glanced down. Someone had bandaged her wound with expert precision. They didn't want her to die. Not yet. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the glass coffee table between them. "You've made quite a mess, darling. You and that little journalist friend of yours." Amira stared at her. Eleanor smiled. "You look so much like your mother." That sentence sent a spike of rage through Amira's veins. "Don't talk about my mother." Eleanor tilted her head. "Why not? I knew her far better than you did." Amira's fingernails dug into her palms. Eleanor leaned back, sighing. She was difficult, always poking her nose where it didn't belong. She should have known better. She should have stayed quiet. She took another slow sip of wine. "You should have stayed quiet, too." Amira's heartbeat thundered. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. "You had her killed." Eleanor didn't deny it. Instead, she simply smiled. "And yet, here I am, and she's not." Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Then, Eleanor leaned in slightly. "I need to know something, sweetheart." Her blue eyes locked onto Amira's, piercing straight through her. "Are you willing to die for the truth?" Meanwhile, Leah's hands clenched around the steering wheel, her knuckles turning white. She hadn't slept, hadn't stopped moving since the firefight. Vincent Merrick sat beside her in the passenger seat, his arm wrapped in bloody bandages, looking paler than usual but still smirking like the devil himself. Leah wasn't in the mood for his games. Where would they take her? She snapped. Vincent exhaled, adjusting his position with a wince. "They won't kill her." "Not yet." Leah shot him a glare. "I asked where, not if." Vincent studied her for a moment, then shrugged. "Eleanor Graves has a guest estate outside the city. Old money likes their little hideaways." Leah's grip tightened. "Then that's where we're going." Vincent let out a dry laugh. "You're going to march into Eleanor Graves' mansion alone." Leah didn't answer, because in her mind, it wasn't a question. Vincent sighed, rubbing his temple. "You are the most stubborn woman I've ever met." Leah glanced at him. "You coming or not?" Vincent chuckled, then reached into his coat and pulled out a sleek, black revolver. "Let's pay the lady a visit." Back at the mansion, Eleanor placed her empty wine glass on the table and sighed. "I'm going to give you a choice, Amira." She gestured toward the golden handcuffs around Amira's wrists. "You can stay in this room, safe, untouched, comfortable. You will leave the city, change your name, disappear." Her smile widened. "I will give you wealth beyond your wildest dreams. I will give you a new life." Then her eyes darkened. Or, she leaned forward, you can keep fighting, and I will bury you just like I buried your mother. Amira felt the rage swell inside her. Her mother had chosen to fight. She had chosen to speak, and she had died for it. Amira had always wondered what she would do in that moment, when facing real power. And now she knew. Go to hell. Eleanor's expression didn't change. Wrong answer. She stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from her dress. The doors opened behind her, and James Whittaker stepped in. Amira's body went cold. Eleanor turned to James, smiling slightly. Take care of her. James nodded, his smirk cruel. Eleanor walked to the doorway, then paused, glancing back. You remind me of your mother, you know. Her voice dropped. And she screamed, too. Amira lunged toward her, rage boiling over. But James grabbed her by the hair and yanked her back down onto the couch. Eleanor chuckled. Goodbye, sweetheart. And then she was gone. James turned to Amira, his grip tightening. You made a mistake, kid. Amira's breath came in short, sharp bursts. James leaned in, lowering his voice. Do you know how easy it is to make a body disappear? She refused to answer. James sighed and pulled out his gun, pressing the barrel to her temple. No final words. He mused. Amira's heart slammed against her ribs. Then, boom. The front doors exploded inward. Gunfire erupted in the hallway. James jerked back, spinning toward the sound. The entire estate shook from the impact. And then, in the middle of the smoke, Leah walked in. Gun raised, eyes burning. Behind her, Vincent Merrick stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. You miss me, Jimmy. James' face twisted in rage. Amira felt the handcuffs loosen. Leah had tossed her a key. And as her hands finally came free, Amira picked up a fallen pistol, loaded the chamber, and stood. She turned toward James Whittaker, her finger resting on the trigger. Let's finish this. Reckoning in blood and fire. The mansion trembled with the force of the explosion. Smoke billowed from the shattered front doors as gunfire erupted in the grand hall, bullets ripping through the lavish interior. Amira stood, her hands free for the first time since she had been taken, a stolen pistol firmly gripped in her hands. This was it, the final battle. Leah reloaded her gun without taking her eyes off James Whittaker, her expression cold and calculating. Vincent Merrick cracked his knuckles, his face stretched in a lazy smirk. James Whittaker spat onto the marble floor, his expression twisted in rage. You don't know when to quit, do you? Vincent chuckled, stepping forward. Nah, I really don't. And then everything exploded into violence. The battle for the truth. Boom, boom. Leah fired first, 2 clean shots. The first bullet slammed into James's shoulder, spinning him backward. The second missed by a fraction, embedding into the gilded doorframe behind him. He grunted in pain but didn't go down, didn't even hesitate. Instead, James grabbed the nearest guard's rifle, his movements fluid, practiced, like a man who had spent his entire life training for war. The guards flanked him, raising their weapons, and then the entire mansion turned into a battlefield. Vincent dove behind a thick, leather couch, his pistol barking as he took down the first of James's men. Leah spun, her movements precise as she ducked low and fired, dropping another attacker. Amira pressed herself against the grand piano, heart pounding, vision narrowing. She raised the pistol in her hands, steadying it as her sights locked onto James Whittaker. She wouldn't miss. Not this time. She pulled the trigger. CLITK. Empty. Amira's stomach sank. James's eyes snapped to hers, a wide, bloody grin stretching across his face. Big mistake, kid. He charged at her, gun raised. But then, bang! Vincent's bullet struck him in the knee, and James collapsed with a snarl, blood pooling onto the marble floor. Vincent winced, pressing a hand to his wounded shoulder. Damn, I'm good. Leah was already moving. She kicked away James's gun, then pressed her own against his forehead. "It's over." James laughed. A low, bitter sound, full of hatred. "You think this ends with me?" Amira stepped forward, eyes burning. "It ends with all of you." Her hand shook with adrenaline as she grabbed James's own pistol, flipping it in her hands. James watched her, his expression unreadable. "Go ahead then. Be the executioner." Silence stretched. For a moment, Amira considered it. All the pain, the suffering, the lies. She could end it right here. With one bullet. She pressed the barrel against his forehead. Her finger tightened on the trigger. James didn't flinch, didn't beg. Instead, he smiled. "That's right. You're your father's daughter, aren't you?" The words hit her like a slap. Her stomach twisted. And for the first time, she saw herself in James's cold, dead eyes. She saw what she could become. No, that wasn't her. With a sharp breath, Amira lowered the gun. James tilted his head, his grin widening. "Not a killer after all, huh?" Amira's voice was cold as steel. "No, but I don't have to be the one who ends you." She turned toward Leah. "Call the FBI." Leah nodded, with pleasure. James snorted, shaking his head. "You don't get it, do you? You think this changes anything? Eleanor's still out there. She'll burn the whole damn city to keep herself clean." Amira clenched her jaw. Let her try. Because she wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid. The fall of Eleanor Graves. 1 hour later, Eleanor Graves was seated in the VIP lounge of an exclusive 5-star hotel, swirling a glass of aged cognac between her fingers. She was calm, poised, untouchable, until she wasn't. The moment she looked up, her expression hardened, because standing in front of her was Judge Alan Graves, her husband, her betrayer. Alan's hands were shaking, his usual polished exterior cracked. "It's over, Eleanor." She sighed. "Please, Alan, don't be dramatic." Alan threw a thick file onto the table, his expression twisted in rage. Inside was every piece of evidence Amira had uncovered. Bank transactions, witness statements, the affidavit Camille Benson had written before her murder. And at the bottom, a signed confession from James Whittaker. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her glass. For the first time in decades, fear flickered across her face. Alan's voice was quiet. "The FBI has enough to charge you." Eleanor exhaled, setting down her drink. Then she smiled. "You're a fool, Alan." She stood up, adjusting her silk dress. "Do you really think prison can hold me?" Alan didn't respond, because at that moment, the hotel doors burst open, and a wave of FBI agents swarmed in. Eleanor stiffened. This wasn't supposed to happen. 2 agents grabbed her arms, forcing her hands behind her back. Cold steel clamped around her wrists. Handcuffs. Not the golden ones she had put on Amira, but the kind reserved for criminals. Alan watched in silence as his wife, the queen of Atlantis corruption, was finally dragged away. For the first time in years, he felt something close to relief. But he knew this wasn't the end. Because somewhere, in the city's darkest corners, someone else was waiting. Waiting to take Eleanor's place. The cycle never truly ended. But this time, there was someone who would fight back. 1 month later, Amira stood in front of the courthouse, the cool wind brushing against her face. Cameras flashed, journalists swarming as she stepped onto the podium. She had a choice now. She could walk away, let the city clean up its own mess. Or she could finish what her mother started, her hands clenched into fists. And then, she stepped up to the microphone and spoke. Because this time, the truth wasn't going to die. The final judgment. The truth goes public. Amira's voice echoed across the courthouse steps, amplified by the microphones before her. For years, this city has been controlled by people who think they are untouchable. People like Eleanor Graves. People like James Whittaker. People like my father. Her hands gripped the podium as she leaned forward, her eyes scanning the sea of reporters, onlookers, and cameras capturing every word. They silenced my mother. They tried to silence me, but no more. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Behind her, Leah stood silently, arms crossed, her expression calm but her presence an unspoken mourning. Next to her, Vincent Merrick leaned against a marble column, a small smirk playing on his lips as if daring anyone to interrupt. Amira held up a stack of papers, evidence she and Leah had compiled over weeks of painstaking effort. These documents prove everything. The bribes, the cover-ups, the murders. The Graves family empire ends today. Gasps rippled through the crowd as journalists scrambled to capture the moment. But Amira wasn't finished. She glanced toward the courthouse steps where her father stood, surrounded by federal agents, his head bowed. And as for my father, Alan Graves lifted his eyes, his face etched with guilt. He will answer for his crimes, just like the rest of them. The weight of her words struck him visibly. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time in his life, Alan Graves, the untouchable judge, seemed small. Amira took a deep breath, letting the tension in her chest dissolve. This is not just about my family. This is about every family who has been torn apart by people who thought their wealth made them gods. It's time to hold them accountable. A cheer erupted from the crowd. For the first time in years, it felt like justice was within reach. Eleanor's last stand. Far from the courthouse, in a cold, sterile prison holding cell, Eleanor Graves sat alone. Her designer dress had been replaced with an orange jumpsuit, but her posture remained regal, her expression unbothered. Her attorney sat across from her, a thin, wiry man with sharp eyes that darted nervously. "You're facing life without parole," he said, flipping through the thick file in his hands. "The evidence is overwhelming. The FBI has recordings, documents, and testimonies. If this goes to trial—" Eleanor interrupted him with a wave of her hand. "It won't." Her calm, icy demeanor sent a shiver down his spine. "Ma'am, the prosecution isn't going to offer a deal. They want to make an example of you. Then they don't know who they're dealing with." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her eyes sharp as knives. "I've survived worse than this. And I will survive this, too." Her attorney hesitated, unsure if her confidence was brilliance or delusion. But Eleanor Graves wasn't planning to spend her life behind bars. Somewhere in the depths of her mind, she was already plotting her escape. The last goodbye. A week later, Amira visited her father in federal custody. The prison was cold, its walls sterile and unwelcoming. Alan Graves sat at a small metal table in the visitor's room, his once pristine appearance now worn and haggard. His hands were cuffed, his back hunched, but his eyes met hers with something she hadn't seen before: sincerity. Amira sat across from him, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. Finally, Alan spoke. "You were right to expose me." Amira's jaw clenched. "That doesn't make what you did okay." Alan nodded, his gaze dropping to the table. "I know. And I don't expect your forgiveness. But for what it's worth—" He hesitated, his voice trembling. "I'm proud of you." The words hit her harder than she expected. For years, she had wanted to hear those words. But now, they felt hollow. Amira stood, her chair scraping against the floor. "I didn't do this for you. I did it for Mom." Alan's eyes glistened, but he nodded. "Goodbye, Dad." As she walked away, Amira felt the weight of her father's crimes lift off her shoulders. She wasn't living in his shadow anymore. She was free. 1 year later, the sun was setting over Atlanta as Amira stepped onto the stage. A crowd of hundreds gathered in front of her, cheering as she took the microphone. The past year had been a whirlwind. Trials, testimonies, investigations, but for the first time, it felt like the city was moving toward real change. Leah stood nearby, smiling proudly, while Vincent leaned casually against the stage railing, giving her a mock salute. Amira raised a hand to quiet the crowd. 1 year ago, I stood before you and promised to expose the truth. The crowd roared in response. Today, I promise you something more. I promise to rebuild what they destroyed, to bring justice to every family that's been wronged, to make sure this city belongs to its people, not the ones who think their money gives them power. The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices rising like a tidal wave. And as Amira looked out at the sea of faces, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Epilogue. The shadows remain. In a dark corner of the world, a man sat at a desk, his face obscured by shadows. He slid a folder across the desk, its cover marked with a single name. Amira Lawson. A figure on the other side of the desk leaned forward, their fingers tapping against the wood. She's a problem, the figure said. The man nodded. But problems can be solved. The room fell silent, the tension thick as smoke. Finally, the figure spoke. Make it happen. And just like that, the cycle began again. But this time, Amira was ready.